Do you really need a planing jig when you're making an epoxy table? Yes, you do. But which one? I created 3 planing jigs myself, so you don't have to. So stick around to see which one I think is the best one. Each of these has its own benefits and its own flaws, and I'll do my best to explain each of them in this video. If you've seen my first video on this channel and you have a keen eye, you may have seen that I was planing that table with the most rudimentary planing jig out there. I just slapped some melamine pieces together, made a wide hole in the middle, and voila, I had a jig. All I had to do was use the damn thing. Did it do its job? Yes. Did it do it well? Well, no. It did a terrible job. If you search on YouTube for planing jig keywords, you'll most probably get quite a few versions of this jig, either made from melamine or plywood, which is fine. And trust me, the jig itself is just fine if you're not in a hurry to finish your work. So why are these types of jigs so popular then? Well, first of all, which is also the most obvious reason, it's really cheap to make. Every woodworker out there, yes, even if you're just starting, by the time they've finished their first mold, they have the offcuts and extra pieces and most probably enough to make this thing. So with this, a jigsaw, some screws and a level, you have everything you need to build your jig. Secondly, it's fast to build. It will only take you 30 minutes to an hour to build this jigama thingy, and you're ready to plow wood like nobody's business. But what about the elephant in the room? What's wrong with settling with this jig? Why isn't this good enough? It's sanding. Lots and lots of sanding. While this jig does its job, it flexes a lot and it causes an uneven surface. By the time you're done planing with this jig, you have differences up to a millimeter or 0.03 inches, which may not sound like much, but when you're sanding, that's a whole damn lot. Secondly, and I think this is the more important issue, is the fact that I, for one, am not always making tables at the same height. Nor do I have material which is always the same thickness. And when adjustments are needed, it takes a lot of fiddling around. Yes, you can adjust a bit of your height from the router itself, but not much, maybe 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch. But above that, and you need to readjust your sides. This brings us to the second version of the planing jig. This is another version you can find quickly on YouTube, which is a more sophisticated version, but flawed nonetheless. When I made this jig, I was 100% sure that this was the one for me and that I would be more than happy with it. And boy oh boy was I wrong. Don't get me wrong, it's a nice jig to have and many people use it. But for me, and for my table, which is 2.3 meters by 1.6 meters, it wasn't good at all. When I started this jig, I decided to document the process, so I started filming how I built it. I'll go through this one a bit more in detail because some of you may want to build this, and this way you'll have a bit of insight on how to do it. So, what did I need for this jig then? Well, I ordered 2 CNC linear rails to screw to the side of my table, which solved my issue with having a box to work in. This cleared up the sides, so I could slide things on my work table without having to lift these heavy tables over the edge. I also ordered 2 precision bars. Wherever you look on YouTube, they tell you to buy 12mm or 0.4 of an inch bars, but I went with 16mm ones, which is 0.6 of an inch, just to be sure. Along with these, I ordered bearings and supports to have everything for the jig. The last thing I bought was some plexiglass so I can see through the jig. Having all the materials, I started building. As I said before, First, I slapped my linear rails on the side of my table. Then, I took the plate of the router and placed it on the plexi and started measuring. It took me a while to figure out the best position for it on the plexiglass, and even so, I still didn't have enough space for the bearings to all fit on the piece. After I was pretty sure of the positioning of the router on the piece, I scribed the pattern of the router plate on the plexi so I can find the position of the hole I had to drill for the bit to go through. Then, after some more measurements, I made a hole through the plexiglass for the router bit. To be honest, I struggled a bit to find the center of the hole I had to drill, and I wasn't in any mood to do all the triangle stuff to find it, so I decided to just sand it. Speaking of bearings, it was time to put those on the plexiglass. I started by trying to figure out which is the best position for them so they had enough room for the precision bars to slide beside the router and also have enough space for my hands to grab it. It took me a few minutes to figure things out, but I finally decided on a position. Once I had said position, it was time to mark the holes for them. But because I didn't have a pattern for them, I decided to put some tape on a drill bit until it fit in the hole in the bearings so I can have the marks dead center. It's a neat trick you can use if you want to leave a mark centered. Now, it was time to mark the holes. I brought my precision bar so I was 100% sure the bearings were aligned and not dragging, and I hammered the mark onto the plexiglass for the holes. After making each one, I started drilling them, and of course, things weren't as easy as it seemed. Once I drilled the holes for each bearing, I had to go over them one more time to make the hole a bit bigger. That's because as much as I tried, I could not get those holes to match 100%, so with a little bit of wiggling of the drill, I made everything fit properly. Now, the last thing I had to do with the plexiglass was to make the holes for the router. These are just small holes, which will help you screw the router to the plexiglass. Again, it wasn't very hard to do, but I did have to mark everything again with the dowel bit, then drill them in. So this is the result so far. I made some short videos from the side and bottom, so you can see the placement of every piece. I do think I did a pretty good job with this. With the plate done, it was time to figure out how I would mount the precision bars onto the bearings. While I did think of building the supports for these out of 3mm steel plate, I started having some doubts on how good this jig would work, so I decided to build this out of melamine just to see how it will turn up, and if I liked it, I would place an order for the plates. Now, looking at this, I think it was a very smart decision on my side because I didn't have to spend any more money to finish this, and I'm glad I didn't because, as you'll see a bit later, I scrapped this idea too. Anyway, I cut some melamine to the dimensions I wanted and started measuring where the bearings would fit on it. I decided it's best to do this by measuring the bearings holes position, then put everything on the melamine. I also countersunk every hole because I didn't want to catch my clothes each time I went beside this thing. For some reason, I didn't like how the melamine was sitting on the rail, so I also decided to make another small piece perpendicular to the original one in order for the whole thing to be able to rest on the table. I think this was a little bit of a mess up on my part because once you screw the bar, everything stiffens up, and having this caused a lot of sawdust to gather up there and fill in the bearings with gunk. If you're trying to build this, don't make this piece because it's useless and it just causes more issues than it solves. The last thing I needed was to cut everything to length. I did this last because I wanted to make sure the jig was level. I know my table is level, so the only thing I had to do was to be sure that both the supports were at the same height, and then the whole jig would be level too. Now that we're at the correct length, I just had to screw the supports for the precision bars. I decided to do this as simple as possible, so I just pre-drilled a 5mm hole and screwed them in. There are no big forces acting on these, so they just needed to sit in place. Even so, I screwed in some big screws just to be on the safe side. Now that everything's done, I think it's time to see the results. You can clearly see that when I'm planing, there are small lines which show up. Those are difference in level. And yes, more sanding afterwards. I'll let my younger self explain what's going on. It's flexing too much. We need a better, sturdier solution than this, so let's fix this. So, what's the upside of building this kind of jig then? Well, it's a very sturdy solution if you're planning on planing smaller tables. It doesn't interfere with your workflow in any way because you don't have those sides on your table, and you can slide your pieces onto the table with ease. Another very big advantage of a jig like this is that it runs very smoothly, especially if you have a dust extractor hooked up to it. So what's wrong then? Well, as younger me said, it's all about deflection. Once you start planing with this jig, even though the bars are pretty beefy, they still allow for about 0.5 millimeter of deflection, and this is all translated into your tables. The only good way I found to get rid of these was to add an extra step to my workflow, and that was to use a belt sander with 40 or 80 grit paper and go to town on the table to even things out. On a big dining table like this adds another few hours of sanding to the process, which, yeah, we all hate. Money is another issue with this. CNC parts aren't cheap, and this jig cost me about $400. Another issue I found with this jig at these dimensions was the fact that I had to get up on the table to be able to plane the whole table. It's not the end of the world. I've done sketchier things in my life, but if I went this far, for sure I thought I could make it better. What I did was I posted the second jig on some local woodworking groups on Facebook, and in one of the comments someone suggested a metal jig. So I hopped on it really quickly. I also decided that I needed to solve once and for all the height issue. I went on AliExpress and bought a few more things. Firstly, I bought a spindle mount, which let me control my spindle's height. Then I bought a spindle motor with a shoe and some CNC wire holder so it won't get tangled up in my work. I'll let again my younger self do some talking regarding how I built this and why I didn't film this. I didn't film this because it was way too messy and I had to weld outside, but let me just show you what I did here. So this is the new system where I bought a motor for this. You can go horizontally, you can go vertically, up and down. I'm still waiting for the motor to come in, and you can go front and back. So now this should be sturdy enough for it not to have any deflection. I'm sorry for not filming, but yeah, it was a pain to build because I don't have the space and I don't know how to weld, and I don't want to show this to the camera. Look at these welds. The nice thing with this was the fact that square tubing is cheap. I bought the whole batch for less than $100 and paid another $50 at a local shop to cut me the pieces I needed for the supports. I also have a MIG welder and I could do this myself. As I said, I'm not a good welder. I only occasionally weld and I almost always use flux core. I think the total cost of this jig would be about $200 more from the last one, including the spindle that I bought. I painted the whole thing and waited for the parts to come, which took about 4 weeks unfortunately, but they were way cheaper than I could find locally. Finally, after 4 weeks of waiting, I've got my spindle. Let's open this up. Got the inverters here. Manual. Cable. And the inverter itself. With all its commands. It's upside down. So this is the speed, start, stop, Chinesium of course. The spindle. So here we have the spindle, the collet, and the cables. We're gonna see how we're gonna put those. It's a ER11, so let's mount this up. Now that I had the spindle, I needed to attach it somehow to the mount. And I had some scrap 3mm plate lying around and made a piece out of that. I already had a small piece created for the mount by the shop, but it took a few days to get them from the shop, so I decided it was easier for me to build one myself because I already had the hole pattern and I just needed to cut a piece out and drill some holes to fit both sides. After I cut the plate to size, I took the old plate I had and transferred the holes on the jig's side. I did this easily. And then things got even better because the mount itself didn't have any holes into it, so I could go ballistic and was able to do the holes on that side through both pieces at the same time. This ensured alignment and it didn't require much finessing. I do have to go get cables for this, so off to the shop I go. The only setback I had with this was the fact that I did have to hook everything up on the electrical side. But it was just a few wires I needed to solder together and that was it. The spindle is a 3-phase motor, so it came with an inverter and I was hooking up to a single phase 220 volts. The manual for it already had the diagram for hooking everything up, so I did and mounted it on the wall. On the inverter you also have the controls, so I mounted it right beside my exhauster and it was pretty close to where I do all my planing. The last piece of the puzzle was the exhaust shoe, and I think that's the piece I was the most happy about. Planing a table causes a ton of sawdust and plastic dust from the resin. When planing with this without a shoe, my shop would get dusty in seconds, and I had to wear a mask just to be able to breathe. Let me start by stating the obvious here. I 100% love the last jig I built. It's sturdy, it only deflects as much as the bearings allow it to, and I don't need to jump on the table to use it. I can move way faster than the other two, but it's more expensive to build. If you're like me and don't want to break the bank, you also need to wait for all the parts to come in, which is a bummer if you're on a tight schedule. But if this is the case, then you can just build the first variant and use that until your parts get in and build it in a weekend when you have the time. If you don't have a welder, you do need to find someone to weld this thing together and you need it to be square and tight. But I think any average welder can do this. If I manage to do it, then I think anyone can. So if you have $400-500 to spend on a good jig, I would recommend going for it. It's not that hard to build one. As for the second variant, I would only suggest this if you only need to plane narrow pieces of wood. Anything over 60 centimeters or 20 inches will deflect and make your sanding process a living hell. Anyway, that's it for this project. I'm really happy how I built this last jig and I really hope I'll see you guys in my next video. Please like and subscribe to my channel because this helps my morale a lot and motivates me to make better videos and build better stuff. If you're interested in the tables that I build, you can visit my website. The link is down in the description. There You can also find links to my Instagram, where I usually post things in advance, so make sure to follow me there too. See you in the next one.